And we are live. Welcome, everyone, to our event today on Fat Leonard, the biggest scandal you completely forgot about in the US Navy. I'm so excited that we have such a great group of people with us, and I'm really excited that you joined us today. This is an issue that's been close to my heart for a long time, mostly because I'm so frustrated that people have forgotten about it, that it didn't get the attention it deserved. And when you read into it, you learn about oversight failures at one layer after another, after another, after another. And that's really worrying about accountability for those who were bad actors in this event, and worry about how we prevent this sort of thing in the future. I am joined today by Dan Grazier. He is the Jack Shanahan Military Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight. Dan is a former Marine Corps captain. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he is the only person I know in the policy world who has continued to raise this issue on a regular basis and keep trying to drive attention to this major problem. And he's also the guy you want to go to learn about what the F-35 is doing today. We're also joined by Lacey Healy. She's the founding CEO of Inkstick Media, where she serves as editor-in-chief of the foreign policy magazine Inkstick, an executive producer and host of the PRX and Inkstick-produced podcast, Things That Go Boom, which I highly recommend. And right now we're in season 6, and the theme is oversight. So it's so perfect that we have Lacey here with us today. And best of all, we are so honored to be joined by David Schaus. He graduated from Auburn University with a Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering in 1999, and then went straight to the Navy as a commissioned officer. And there he was a whistleblower in the Fat Leonard scandal, not sucked in like so many of his colleagues were. Following his time in the Navy, he founded the Irwin Group, where they do container vestige voyage repairs and all kinds of really technical things. He now lives in Hong Kong with his wife and 2 kids, and I hope he tells us more about all of that. I will be your moderator. I'm a fellow with the R Street Institute, and because so few people know what we're talking about when we say Fat Leonard, when I've been bringing this up to people, they say, I'm not aware of that. And then when you explain, they say, oh, that should be a movie. And it should, but because you may have forgotten, we're going to start with Dan, who will set the scene for us and help us figure out what's going on before we dive into David's experience as a whistleblower, the first person who picked up that something was really wrong here, and then Lacey will help us unpack the cost of failed oversight. It's so much more than money. And while Dan starts, I will put our speakers' full bios in the chat. Take it away, Dan.
Hey, thank you, Nan. Well, let's just start off with a little background on Leonard Glenn Francis. So he is a Malaysian businessman who operated his company, a company called Glenn Defense Marine Asia. He was based out of Singapore, but he had operations all over that part of the world. He's commonly referred to as Fat Leonard, and that is pretty literal because he is about 6'5". And at one point, I think he tipped the scales around 400 pounds. So he's a very, very big guy, and he certainly earned his nickname. He has a really shady background. He was involved in a lot of organized crime activities as a young man, and even spent some time behind bars on a firearms possession charge in Malaysia. So the company Glen Defense Marine Asia, they provided husbanding services, like kind of really basic services for ships. They would when a vessel would come into port, they would arrange for tugs to push it into its proper berthing. Then they would pump off sewage from the ships and supply fresh water. They would also, GDMA also had a little private army of mostly like ex-soldiers, and they would provide security for ships. And a little fleet of boats to also patrol the waters around the ships to help keep them secure. And they would also, plug the ships into electricity and provide, phone service, and even arrange transportation for the crew, to include limousine services for a lot of the officers on these ships. So the business model of GDMA, it hinged on ensuring that the Navy's biggest ships made port visits to locations where GDMA operated. And you might be wondering why the Navy has to contract these kind of services out. Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact, particularly in that part of the world, because the big naval base at Subic Bay closed in 1992. So a lot of those services the Navy would do those in-house there. But when that Navy base closed, the Navy had to look outside for contractors to service their ships as they were operating in that part of the world. Now, it has to be conceded at the very beginning that because of that, Fat Leonard provided important services for the Navy and helped the Navy operate. He would help them operate through a lot of the complex bureaucratic and customs issues in these foreign ports. And something else he would do is he was able to help sailors when they got in a bind. As a father of an 18-year-old enlisted sailor myself, I know that young people of that age often don't make the best decisions in the world, and they can sometimes run afoul of the law when they get on shore, particularly after they've been cooped up on a ship for weeks or months on end. And Leonard would actually smooth things over with the authorities and get sailors out of a bind. And so it wasn't all bad. He did useful things, but unfortunately it did go bad. And just to give you an idea of the scale of his operations, by 2011, Francis had $200 million worth of Navy contracts. Now, if he had just contained himself to being a reliable and honest businessman, he would very likely still be making a great deal of money working with the Navy in the Pacific. But of course, Leonard went well beyond honest dealings, and he attempted to corner the market in that part of the world, and he accomplished this through bribery. So he targeted mostly Navy officers, but also a few enlisted personnel, and he would bribe them to provide him with information about ship movements, and to even alter itineraries to make sure that the ships went to ports where GDMA operated. And particularly, he was really interested in the aircraft carriers. So the biggest ships obviously required the most services, and provided greater opportunity to profit from them. And he also wanted to steer them to particular ports, because some ports he was able to charge more money than he was in others. So and that's where the story really gets bad. So the bribes that he gave included a lot of cash, but it also included lavish dinners and boxes of expensive cigars and bottles of liquor and hotel stays, trips around the world for the sailors and sometimes even their families. And he would also provide gifts, like even simple things. There was one case where he provided a young enlisted sailor with a portable gaming device. It was something like a PlayStation Portable or something like that. But he would also give things like expensive luxury goods. There was one case where one of the sailors he was working with and he was bribing, who was having problems in his marriage. So Leonard gave him a Louis Vuitton bag for the sailor to give to his wife as a gift. It was things like that. But then the most salacious part of it is Leonard also had an army of prostitutes, unfortunately, that he would fly in from around the world, to be there at these big parties that he was throwing at expensive hotels whenever one of these ships were in port. So, but once these ships were in port, Francis would be able to recoup the cost of these bribes by inflating his invoices. So he would claim to have provided more services than he actually did. In one obvious case, I think David can talk to this a little bit better. He charged the Navy for more fresh water than the ship's tanks could actually hold. And then he would then bribe people to sign off on these fraudulent invoices. So it was a multi-layer fraud that he had arranged for himself. Now, the government believes that Leonard defrauded the American taxpayers of at least $35 million, but most people believe it was much more than that. But also, when you're engaged in activities like this, you need a lot of protection, and Leonard figured out a way to do that too. So, because there were people that were raising, there were unfortunately few and far between that were raising concerns about his business practices. But Leonard managed to corrupt members of the NCIS to alert him of investigations and to, in many cases, thwart them. So when I first learned about this story, this scandal several years ago, I was shocked by how long this went on and by the vast number of people who were involved. So we think that that this was going on for at least 10 years, and very likely much longer than that. So far, 440 people have been investigated in the case, and that includes 60 admirals. And just to give you an idea of the scale of that, 60 admirals is a quarter of the total number of admirals on active duty. Now, Leonard was arrested on September 16th, 2013 in San Diego. And I think the very fact that he was arrested in San Diego is really significant, because he had flown to California on his own because federal agents posing as Navy officials sent him an invitation to meet with some admirals to discuss future contracts. So the simple fact that he accepted that invitation and flew on his own to California, even though he knew that there were people investigating him, shows just how brazen he really was. Now, so far, more than 30 individuals have been convicted in either civilian or military criminal proceedings, and there are more trials there are more cases that are coming up here in the next couple of weeks. Now, all of those who have been convicted so far have pled guilty. And while it's a good thing to see justice served, there's still a lot we don't know about this case, because none of this evidence has been tried in court during a criminal trial. Now, aside from the legal aspect of this scandal and the scale of the financial fraud, national security, there's a lot of national security concerns as well. So it should scare every single American to think that even one American official would be willing to accept a bribe and give up really sensitive information about military operations, or alter them the way that Fat Leonard was able to. So this scandal shows that there are potentially hundreds of people who did sell out their service for some cigars and, unfortunately, the opportunity to sexually abuse vulnerable women who were trafficked for that purpose. So it's not much of a leap to think or to imagine someone giving, a Chinese official information about, let's say, the defense of Taiwan for some cash and a dinner of Kobe beef. And I think that, long term, the moral effects of the, not just the Navy, but you can kind of see threads of this throughout the rest of the military, even about how casual a lot of this was. The scale of this scandal shows that there was something seriously wrong inside the Navy. Obviously there were a lot of bad apples who were directly involved in this and who did accept bribes. But think about how many people must have known that something like this was going on and didn't say anything. So this scandal really speaks a lot to the culture of silence and the certain knowledge that if you are the person who raises concerns about issues like this, that they knew they were going to face harsh retaliation, and so many people did stay silent. So it's easy to get wrapped up when you talk about Fat Leonard and a lot of the really sordid details of it. But the reason that I've spent so much time studying this case and I've talked about it the way I have is because of the real implications on the institutional culture of not just the Navy but the other services, and how this kind of corruption could be swept under the rug the way it was for so long.
Thank you, Dan. And we'll be hearing more from Dan as we go along. But one person who did not stay silent is David. And if you could describe your experience, how this all started, and what happened to you because you weren't silent, that would be
okay. Yeah, thanks, Nan. Let's go back to 2004 when I was a young 26-year-old Lieutenant Schaus. I was working at the U.S. Consulate General, Hong Kong, and it was a really cool job because not only was I a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, I was also an accredited diplomat with a diplomatic passport, living in this exotic city of Hong Kong that I had never been to before being assigned there. And it was all really quite exciting and wonderful. And prior to Glenn Defense being awarded this contract to provide these services in Hong Kong, these services were done in-house by the Ship Support Office, Hong Kong, which I was the assistant officer in charge of. I was mostly the officer in charge because they sent my boss to Iraq, or pardon me, Afghanistan for most of the time I was there. And it was also interesting to me because I was not a supply corps officer. I was a surface warfare officer. So I didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about how things were supposed to go. I was from the operational side of the Navy. So I'm going to tell you about the first time I thought there was something wrong. And that was a strike group visit. I believe it was the Abraham Lincoln strike group. And I was sitting in on the settlement of invoices meeting that they have at the end of the port visit, where people lay out their invoices with the contractor and they discuss if there's any discrepancies or anything like that. And then follow that meeting, the supply officers would write treasury checks to the contractor and pay for the services. And during this meeting, as Dan mentioned, I had just come off of a DDG. I was previously the navigator on USS Gonzales. And if you're a surface warfare officer, you have certain basic knowledge about your ship. And one of those would be how much fresh water a DDG can hold. And I believe at the time it was 12,000 gallons of water. It's been a number of years, so maybe that is wrong now, but I think it's still 12,000 gallons of fresh water. And Leonard had presented a trip ticket and invoice for an amount of water that far exceeded that in a single delivery. And I pointed out that that was not possible. You can't put more water in a ship than can be held by a ship. And, and one of the big items they would make a lot of money on was the sewage disposal. And the sewage disposal has to have some type of relationship with the fresh water, because where'd the sewage come from? So I brought up these issues, and I didn't think I was being too accusatory, but immediately Fat Leonard, and I'd met him once before this at a meeting that was mostly, cordial. This meeting was not. He stood up. He asked me straight out if I was accusing him of lying. And I said something to the effect of, no, I'm telling you that you can't have delivered this much water. There's a problem here. And he asked me again if I thought he was lying. And I said, yes. At which point, he stood up and he banged on the table And it was quite embarrassing for everyone sitting around the table, that we were having this argument. And finally, I just told him to leave. And he told me that lieutenants don't tell him to leave. And I said, well, I guess we're at an impasse now. You need to leave. At that point, I was thinking I'm going to call the police on this guy, but he did. He left. And that's when I figured out something that I thought was just strange was going to turn into a big problem for me. And ultimately it destroyed my career in the Navy. I knew that problem. I started understanding the magnitude of that problem when I got a call from my commanding officer. Now, my commanding officer, he was a special person. His name was Captain David Fitzgerald. And I'm going to give you some quotations from Captain David Fitzgerald, who, by the way, went on and still may be working at the Office of Personnel Management. So if you happen to run into him, please run by some of these quotes. He called me up and he said, "Lieutenant Schaus, get back in your box." Then he said, "Lieutenant Schaus, it's not your job to investigate Glenn Defense Marine." And when I quoted some Navy official that had said something to the effect that it's all our job to stop fraud, waste, and abuse, he said, "Lieutenant Schaus, stop investigating Glenn Defense." So I was quite taken aback by this. My time in the operational Navy to date had been positive. It was pretty easy to figure out what the right thing was to do. And if you did it, you had an expectation that you would be supported by your chain of command. So this really shook some of the basic foundations that I had in the Navy. I want to review some of the other items that I did to try to bring attention to this, all of which were ultimately not successful. I called the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline, I think 3 times. For the Ronald Reagan strike group, when Ensign Tom Tang came into my office and said that they had falsified all the invoices in Kuala Lumpur and intended to falsify the invoices in Hong Kong, I called my chain of command and told them I was calling NCIS because someone had just admitted this and this needed to be investigated. So NCIS, the officer that was assigned for the strike group visit, stayed an extra day to take some statements from me. She created a report and did an investigation that was ultimately forwarded to Captain Terry Kraft, who was the commanding officer of the Abraham Lincoln strike group. I'm sorry, not Abraham, the Ronald Reagan strike group. I'm sorry, the Ronald Reagan, the aircraft carrier. And what I found interesting about that is that I had accused, and I still accuse Admiral David Pimpo of, colluding with Glenn Defense to falsify those invoices. Well, now, later on, David Pimpo was given a punitive letter of reprimand. Doesn't mention anything about the investigation I requested in that letter of reprimand. So I wonder if NCIS just buried it or not. But the person that was supposed to do something with that investigation was the commanding officer of the Ronald Reagan, who was Terry Kraft, who has also received the punitive letter of reprimand for his inappropriate relationship with Fat Leonard. And then the third person that received the punitive letter of reprimand was the strike group commander, Admiral Miller. So everything was rotten up and down. And me calling up NCIS and demanding the investigation was probably the most powerful thing I ever did and the biggest risk I ever took. And the investigation was forwarded for disposition to people that were in deep in cahoots with this gentleman, Fat Leonard. The other thing I once did is I got so pissed off about this is that I sent an anonymous fax and email to every defense attaché in the APAC region, as well as every NCIS office, where I sent them a summary of his criminal record in Malaysia, which included the weapons charge that he ultimately spent 18 months in jail for. And I included the clause in the contract that said, if you have this type of criminal conviction, you're not even allowed to do business with the US Navy. And I forwarded that to everybody. And the result was I got interrogated by NCIS, where they came to my office. This is when I was a civilian, by the way, and I was out of the Navy. He came to my office in Hong Kong. His name was Special Agent Albert Wong, and he is still a special agent in NCIS. And he interrogated me. And all he wanted to know if I was the person that sent this information, if I was the one that had if I was the one who had accused NCIS of collusion with Fat Leonard, because NCIS was colluding with Fat Leonard. He was their intelligent asset, feeding them garbage information to justify the threat reports that were justifying his huge bills that he was billing to the US Navy. So Special Agent Albert Wong has never answered why he was sent to Hong Kong to interrogate then civilian David Schaus. I think someone should ask him why and demand why, he was allowed to do that. But yeah, the end result was my career in the Navy was effectively ended. I still loved my time in the Navy overall, but this is certainly a black mark on it. And if we're going to discuss with oversight, there was no oversight. Is there oversight now? I don't know. But that concludes my my discussion of my interaction with this issue.
Thank you so much, David. And we're glad that you're a whistleblower who can continue to tell their story. It's so important, not just because of this issue, but for whistleblowers in general to be able to talk about what happened to them and not do so in fear. So as we mentioned, this was just, a host of oversight failures at every level, from not listening to whistleblowers like David, ignoring inspectors general reports, ignoring those NCIS investigations initially that weren't affected by the mole there, and on up through the chain of command, and all the way to Congress, where we've only had 2 hearings where this was kind of mentioned, but no open hearing, just laying this out, helping people understand. And as Dan mentioned, so much of the investigation and the charges and dealing with the judicial fallout of all this has been in San Diego, mostly behind closed doors. So that's why we have Lacey here to talk about what is the cost when we have this kind of oversight failure. We know it's so much more than money, because here the immediate cost, I should say, was $35 million, but that doesn't capture the cost of the investigation. But there's so many other things that are bigger than just dollars and cents.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nan, and thank you all. That's David, I really appreciate everything that you've done and you sharing your story here as well. Again, I'm here just to talk about some of the consequences of failed oversight generally, but also to really drill down on the fact that the human costs of this particular instance of failed oversight are quite huge and might be missed in the midst of a conversation also about the loss of money, which is in Pentagon terms $35 million. It might not seem like a lot of money. We certainly are used to talking about many, many more millions and billions of dollars when we're talking about the Pentagon. However, the costs and the potential costs, particularly of this case, are massive. Not only, I don't know if folks here have listened to the podcast that David was on, that also contains a lot of interview with Fat Leonard himself. But there are a lot of examples here, obviously, of exploitation of women, of a lot of personal, personally very bad things that happened. This all might just seem salacious and like the kind of thing that just happens in the military. Let's be clear. That in and of itself is a cultural problem that has led us to this lack of oversight in part. The fact that our larger societal problems are reflected and condensed in the military in this way. Fat Leonard was seen as one of the guys. He got the work done. He made the sailors happy. He brought a lot of women to the table and a lot of booze, and also was at the same time, in conversations and doing work for China. So there are security breaches here that are at play. In the consequences of all of this, this melee, the military, the Navy is still dealing with massive inability to fill senior leadership roles. This is stalled reportedly stalled hundreds of officers' careers, thinned out the service's flag ranks. This was widespread bad behavior that wasn't being checked. And it's not the first time this has happened. So in terms of the human cost to careers, to families, to women in the military, which has hardly even been discussed in this case, but even in listening to the podcast, I was struck by the fact that Fat Leonard himself says, doesn't matter, women, men, all, everybody in the military, they're like, and he talks very brazenly about folks just being so subject to, so weak in the face of booze and prostitutes, that he was able to come in and have so much influence in this way. I don't think that's quite fair, but he doesn't draw a distinction himself between female and male sailors, and I don't think that that's quite fair either. We're prior to this, the Navy dealt with, a massive scandal at the Tailhook Convention that also thinned out the service's ranks. This also had to do with, female officers, and is definitely something that, in an environment where we have a lack of oversight, a male-heavy environment, a situation in which even the way that we talk, as Carol Cohen has written extensively about, serves to both sanitize the reality of what we're doing, and also further the masculine nature of our conversations around war, and the masculine environment in our conversations around war. There really is a link here, both between what is happening just for fun on the sidelines, and our actions our actions and our ability to fight wars, our ability to prepare for wars, our ability to not have moles in the ranks, not just with regard to we're talking about all of these things, with NCIS, and also Fat Leonard's dealings with other countries, the fact that he was not himself an American, and held such a prominent position within so much of the goings on in the U.S. military. Other folks may want to weigh in on this, but it seems like there are, not only have there been failures of oversight up and down the ranks, but where there has been focus on these issues, it has only scratched the surface of the real impact of this case. And certainly, I'll say, and I can talk about this more, but our season this season of Things That Go Boom, as Nan mentioned, is really focused on congressional oversight and power, how power has migrated into the hands of the president. The human costs of oversight failure are not just limited to cases like these that are may seem unusual to a lot of folks who are looking at, this is certainly a major scandal and something that we don't hear about every day, but we do hear every day about the human impacts of, for example, militarization at the border, or Congress's failure to remove sanctions that are having an impact on real people and not just governments overseas, war authorizations, all of these things that are Congress's responsibility to keep the system running the way that the founders envisioned. When it doesn't get involved, when it doesn't play an active role, real people suffer, and we don't just lose money. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Lacey. I see that we're getting some questions in the chat, and that is great. Please add to them. We'll get to them very, very shortly, because I'm sure you have many. But first, I would like to open it up to everyone. I think we've done a really good job of laying out the situation and just how troubling it is. But why is no one paying attention? Why are so many people unaware of this? And why isn't it getting the oversight it needs, particularly at the congressional level?
I can jump in here real quick. You kind of alluded to it before. I think one of the big problems with this story, and one of the reasons why it hasn't gotten that much attention, is one, it took place a long way away from DC. I mean, we kind of exist in our own little bubble here, and the fact that like these crimes took place far, far away, and the fact that it's the trials, like most of the legal proceedings are taking place in San Diego rather than at federal court in DC, I think makes it easy for DC-based people to kind of ignore. But that's just the legal aspect of it. I don't have a good answer for why members of Congress haven't picked this story up. So I think part of it has to do with the fact that even members of Congress are unwilling to make a lot of waves. So I mean, you just look at votes on military budgets, like the first rule of most national security officials in and around the Capitol are you don't interfere with the flow of money. And so I think a lot of members of Congress are reluctant to really criticize the military, just because they don't want to, they don't want to threaten any potential military contracts coming into their district. But the other part is they don't want to seem like they're being soft on defense. And so there's a lot of reluctance oftentimes to criticize the services about anything, really. But in this case, they really don't want to highlight a lot of really bad, ugly behavior on the part of service members.
I would just add to that I think that when it comes to this particular case, a lot of the focus has been on the bad behavior, and that in itself can in some ways serve to mask the fact that there were some real oversight problems here, that there were some really bad things going on under the surface. I honestly think that a lot of folks in DC recognize that these things are happening in the military, the bad behavior things, and whether they served themselves or they have been in the environment for many years, it's a thing that nobody people to talk about it happening, but there are bad behavior things happening that we are all aware are cultural. And I think when the focus is on the bad behavior stuff, it tends to sort of make people go, and this is awful, and obviously has also happened very publicly on a national level recently, but say, well, boys will be boys, and this is something that the Navy has to deal with, and that's fine. And they don't dig deeper than that. And so I think the role perhaps of folks in this room and folks who do know that this story goes much deeper and that there's an ongoing investigation and that there are other companies involved in this billing scandal and all of these things, go much further than bad behavior. I think it's worth shining a light on those other things.
David, do you have anything to add?
I can't speak very much to the congressional oversight question because I don't really understand how that works. But I think the biggest failure here is that it starts at the top, and it was very difficult seeing all the backslapping and the letters of, BZ messages, letters going around saying that this guy's doing such a great job. It did not create an environment where anybody at a lower level felt comfortable to step forward and say, there's a problem here. And I think that was the biggest failure of leadership. I'm aware that, the high-level supply corps officers were getting personal messages sent over official message traffic, whenever something didn't go Leonard's way. And I could never understand it. I still don't understand it, but that would be my takeaway. I think it started at the very highest levels of the Navy, and that set the tone for everybody else. And a lot of folks got sucked into this that probably shouldn't, because they saw that. And the expression different spanks for different ranks. Yeah, the senior guys got slaps on the wrist. You can read the letters of reprimand they have. I still think that NCIS buried a lot of the evidence that would have justified a more strenuous response against a lot of the senior folks, simply because that would have shown NCIS's culpability in a lot of these matters. The ridiculous situation of NCIS asking Fat Leonard for threat information in ports like in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And he would say, yeah, there's a huge threat here. We got to protect these ships. And NCIS writes up this threat report based on what he's saying, gives it to the captain. And then the captain uses this threat report to justify ordering a $1 million ring of steel, which was a bunch of rusty barges that they would chain up around the ships to keep away a small boat attack. It was comical. And I brought it up on a number of occasions that this was not right. And people told me to shut up. So eventually I shut up about that issue.
We'll go quickly to some questions in the chat. And again, if you have further questions, please go ahead and add them. Jeff has a question for you, David. Did you ever fear for you and your family's safety?
No. There was I was one time asked if Fat Leonard had ever threatened me, and no, he never threatened me. The only person he ever threatened, to my knowledge, was BMC Hunter down in Bali when he failed some water taxi inspections, and he told them never to come back to Bali or else or something like that. But as much as the US Navy never had my back in this situation, the State Department, because I was working in Hong Kong, did. And whereas the Navy failed to show leadership in this. I always felt like I could rely on the State Department, specifically people like Jim Cunningham, who was a consul general. He interceded a couple times to keep people like my commanding officer, David Fitzgerald, from punishing me. Jim Keith, another person that did the right thing when he had opportunities to do the right thing here, and also, kind of put his thumb on the Navy leadership that were trying to do the wrong thing. So yeah, there were people in the U.S. government doing the right thing. The U.S. Navy Supply Corps, as far as I will say, is completely morally bankrupt. I didn't, in my time as a surface warfare officer working in a supply corps command, I never met a single senior supply corps officer that I felt had was able to do the things that person should have done to properly husband the U.S. government's money and do the right thing. They just were not capable of doing that.
Thanks. Mark Tapscott also has a question for you. David, have you ever been interviewed by congressional investigators, either formally or informally?
I've been interviewed by NCIS a number of times. I've been interviewed by DCIS, I think twice. I've been interviewed by the Department of Justice with DCIS once or twice. They tried to, at one point there was a discussion of subpoenaing me to go testify in the trial. But I asked a question the last time I was interviewed by DOJ where they discussed my testifying, and I said, what piece of evidence would you want me to testify to? There's got to be a reason you want me to go there and testify, and nobody could enunciate that reason. So I don't see how I would be helping everything, and I also was not particularly impressed with that. The only reason that this issue has become as large an issue as it is because Department of Justice got involved and took away the decision-making process from Department of Defense. I don't know. I mean, if you go back to some of the things that Dan said when he mentioned, you mentioned that they had a mole in the NCIS. Only one? I don't know. I mean, there's a guy, special agent, I believe his surname's Bellevue, and correct me if I said that wrong. He's still in prison right now. And, what was his role in this? Every time there was an investigation opened up into him, he was feeding Fat Leonard the confidential information about this information. I mean, he was downloading it from the secret, the classified system that it's on and just feeding it to him. You read about the people that have been, Fat Leonard had a public affairs officer on his payroll who also went to jail that was writing up like his responses. So NCIS is feeding him the information about how to get out of this stuff. You've got an active duty senior public affairs officer that's writing up his responses back to that. And here's like a crazy story about my job. The assistant officer in charge role at Ship Support Office Hong Kong was a persistent thorn in Glenn Defense and Fat Leonard's side for many years. So what did Fat Leonard do? He got rid of the position. He got rid of the billet for the assistant officer in charge, my billet. He got rid of it by having, I believe it's one of the gentlemen, I use that word gentleman loosely, on trial right now. I believe it was Norton that somehow colluded with Commander Naval Forces Japan and made a case that billet needed to go away for some budgetary purpose or something like that. But the net effect is that Fat Leonard makes human resources decisions for the US consulate Hong Kong. And that's insane. Not only does Fat Leonard, did he decide what ports aircraft carriers were going to go to, so that, I want the Ronald Reagan Strike Group to go over here because I'm going to make more money if it goes to Lam Shabang in Thailand instead of going to Singapore. So it's not the president of the United States that's, steering this national asset. It's this Malaysian dude that's trying to make more money. And it's this Malaysian dude that's making personnel decisions like via different sources, and got rid of my billet at the US consulate Hong Kong, which, by the way, is still not there. I mean, it's still gone. So anyone listening, I don't know, should it come back? I don't know, but Fat Leonard got rid of it. So there's all kinds of crazy stuff that has happened over the years that has made me want to scratch my head. But no, getting back to the initial question, no congressional staffer has approached me, but plenty of folks from NCIS over the years have. Initially, NCIS has contacted me in a role of at least saying they're trying to figure out, how to prosecute people and gather evidence. But my initial interaction with NCIS, and they're contacting me, we go back to when Special Agent Albert Wong came to my work in Hong Kong when I was a civilian, after I'd sent around all the evidence that Fat Leonard was not entitled to have this contract because he was a criminal. And this fact was, jeopardizing our, women and men in service, and asking people to take action. And he interrogated me in my office and kept demanding, was I the one that had sent this information anonymously? Was I the one making these accusations? At the time I said, no, of course not. I'm not going to admit that, but now I admit it. So that was it. Following that, I made another complaint about how, basically the executive director of Fisk Yokosuka, who was my captain at one time, not David Fitzgerald, another captain, and how, this guy that had absolutely failed in oversight was now the executive director of contracting in an oversight role, and how it made no sense, and how you shouldn't have this person in there. Once again, NCIS comes to Hong Kong, gives me an interrogation, tells me to shut up, stop this and that. Again, nothing happens. Okay, this is all way before 2013. So no, not a whole lot of good work was done in this, and I'm thoroughly unimpressed with NCIS.
Yeah. Well, we're going to try to squeeze in one more quick question from the audience, from Andrew. I think you guys might actually have fun with the question itself. What changes need to take place at DoD to prevent another Fat Leonard from happening? DoD initiated changes or policy changes from Congress. But I think, first of all, Andrew and others need to know that there have been other and continue to be other Fat Leonards. Anyone can answer.
So I would say the first thing that needs to happen is the DoD needs to stop farming out basic functions to contractors. So Fat Leonard is part of a much larger problem of all the contractors. I mean, when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were contractors everywhere, and we all knew that they were all making at least twice, sometimes three times as much as most of us were, but none of us could figure out what they were doing. They were just there all the time. And I mean, you see it even today. I included in the chat about the F-35. One of the big problems with the F-35 is the simple fact that the services can't maintain it themselves. They're relying on Lockheed Martin because the aircraft, the whole program was designed to be a long-term moneymaker for Lockheed Martin. So they built in excess complexity to justify those long-term sustainment contracts. So I think that's the biggest one. The services need to they need to stop shopping this stuff out, and they need to increase their own capacity to provide their own support.
I would say the Byzantine federal acquisition regulations do not help. At one point in time, myself and another person went through a contract that was under solicitation. I mean, before it was solicited, and we went through it and we tried to make some like recommendations on how to make it make more sense. And well, the person that awarded that contract was Sharon Carr, who then went to jail. So that's probably why it didn't work. But I think taking a fundamental look at the federal acquisition regulations and deciding whether these things support the mission or not, and then make changes at that level would be helpful also.
David, would you also like to share about the other fat Leonards very quickly?
Oh, okay. Well, I probably should have done a bit more research, but let's just go back to history real quick. The first mega contract that was ever put out was given to multinational logistics services, about $50 million in around 2002 or something like that in Europe. Well, multinational logistics services has been disbarred after Fat Leonard. There was another mega contract that was put out in the Middle East that was held by ISS Inchcape, who has now been disbarred. And Glenn Defense Marine had the big contract in Asia, who has now been disbarred. I think because of COVID, there's not a whole lot of ship visits going on right now. But a question I've asked is, when the ship visits start going up again, who is actually going to be providing the services to these vessels? Because as far as I can tell, everybody's been disbarred. And if you go back to what Dan said about the government farming out basic services, I couldn't agree. I agree completely. The government has a role in doing things for their fleet. Why do we need these massive husbanding services contracts when the government, from a security standpoint and even from a monetarily standpoint, may be better served by having active duty persons in these roles, like my role was? And we shouldn't allow third parties like Fat Leonard and corrupt officers to get rid of these billets for whatever reason they did it for.
Lacey, do you have any recommended reforms or things that you would like DoD and Congress to do better going forward?
Yeah, I'll just say I agree with David and Dan's recommendations, and we'll just say that this is a big sticky problem that I think goes all the way through a lot of issues, all the way from culture to big tough problems to solve, like what David just suggested, as well as what Dan suggested, and honestly, just chipping away at it is going to be probably the best that Congress can do, but chipping away at it would be more than they're doing now. So,
well, I want to thank all of our guests for being with us. I think we only barely scratched the surface, and with the trial, perhaps the only trial, if no one pleads between now and then, that we might get on this starting on Monday, we might have other reasons to get together and talk about this more in the future. So again, I want to thank you all. I urge our participants to follow them on Twitter, check out their work. Everyone is doing and posting great things. I also want to thank Tom Wright with Project Brazen, who created the Fat Leonard Podcast, to whom we and all Americans owe a debt of gratitude for getting the story straight from Fat Leonard and many others who were affected by this scandal, including David. He did an amazing job. I do want to say, though, I did I was like, we should do a panel on this. And then I found out about the podcast. So we're not imitating, but he certainly does an amazing job. Everyone, everywhere should listen to it. And finally, I want to thank our participants for being with us today. All of us here know that there is a lot of really serious stuff going on elsewhere in the world, and many of you who are interested in this topic also have a lot of other things to focus on, and a lot of worries as we watch events unfold in Eastern Europe, and our thoughts are with our friends there. And we appreciate you taking the time to be with us to discuss this today. And Fat Leonard Podcast is in the chat. So thank you very much. That's it. And we'll be talking again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks all.